Good morning, everyone. Welcome. We're excited to present to you today. We're going to be talking about project development and then project finance. So we have, as Bethany mentioned, 3 speakers for you today. There'll be 2 presentations. The first one generally touching on project development and then a deep dive into project finance. So Toby is a developer with EDP Renewables. He's working on wind and solar projects in the western U.S. And Toby can take us away.
Great. Thanks so much, Heidi. And thanks everyone for being here. It's really exciting to see all the interest in wind power and renewable energy from the next generation of folks currently in school. And really happy that Enril and Heidi are running this program for you all to kind of get some industry exposure and start thinking about some of these issues even in advance of when you graduate. To expand on my background a little bit, I've been in the wind industry just about 10 years now, ever since I myself got out of undergraduate. I hold a degree in applied physics from Cornell University, and following graduation worked doing wind resource assessment for a while at DNV-GL, which is an independent engineer, and then came to work at EDP Renewables and have been doing development there ever since. So I'm focused on both wind and solar in the Western United States, as Heidi mentioned. So I'm going to be giving a presentation today on project development and what that means. And I really love development. I think it's pretty interesting stuff, and hopefully I can kindle a little bit of that interest in all of you all as well. So we'll just go ahead and get going here. So I've got a few things I want to cover. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to our company and then dive right into what development is. That's often a bit of a loaded term that is somewhat unclear what it means. And then we'll talk a bit about how we evaluate trade-offs during development, and then move into talking about levelized cost of energy and how that kind of plays, how the financial model interplays with the development process. So EDP Renewables North America, we are the 4th largest owner-operator of renewable energy in North America, and also globally the 4th largest owner-operator of renewables. So you can see here we have a kind of staggering number of mostly wind, but some solar facilities as well, scattered across the United States, primarily in the Midwest. That's over 50 facilities, or 6.2 gigawatts of clean energy. We've invested in excess of $10 billion in the United States. The company's been around since 2001, when it was started as Zilka Wind. Sorry, can you guys keep yourselves muted? Thanks. So been around for about 17 years, and that's a pretty good amount of investment to make in that period of time, and we're growing pretty fast. We are up to north of 600 employees at this point and hiring. If anybody is getting ready to look for a job, I encourage you to check out our careers page. When I came to the company 5 years or so ago, I think we had maybe just shy of 300 employees, so growing pretty fast. So that's us, that's the shilling. I'm done with that, we'll move on to development now. So what is development? So this is a really simple diagram of the wind project lifecycle, but I think when you hear the word development, it's not the clearest term, and I think when you see it in this context, it makes it a little bit more clear. So basically a wind project goes through what's called development until it's ready to be constructed, and then it gets constructed, and then it goes into the operations period. So essentially, development is everything that happens prior to construction, or everything that happens before a shovel hits the ground. That's kind of my elevator pitch when I'm trying to describe to people I'm meeting what it is that I do. So that entails a lot of different things. At a really high level, development can mean market evaluation. You know, I want to go develop a project. Do I want to be in Colorado, or do I want to be in Montana, or do I want to be in Idaho? You need to look at the power markets there, look at the utilities that are in that state, and determine whether there's going to be demand. You need to look at the wind resource in that state and decide whether the levelized cost of energy that you can offer based on that wind resource is going to be competitive versus market prices, for instance. Or if there's some kind of a state renewable portfolio standard or other incentive that will obligate utilities to purchase clean power. So that's one thing that you do in development. Sort of the next level down from that is siting. Once you've decided to be in a particular state or region, you need to look at the transmission system in that area. You need to look at the wind resources. You need to look at the land use. You need to look at constructability, and essentially on like typically a state-by-state level, say, well, I need to find a place that kind of meets all these different criteria. I need the wind resource to be good, or at least good enough. You know, wind speeds, I need wind to have a wind project. I need to be able to interconnect to the electric system first I need to be able to do it at all, and then I need lines in that area, and then preferably I'd like to be able to do it very cheaply, because the more expensive that is, the worse my project is going to be if that's to bear those costs. Then you need to think about land use. You know, if you're in an area that has a lot of, for example, orchards. Orchards are a land use that is very, very, very high value. It's really difficult to, and typically wind projects, this is more of a solar thing, but just as an example, you know, you don't really want to be trying to take ground out of orchard production for wind projects, because the land is going to be really expensive or unavailable. Constructability is a big one. You know, wind speeds are really high on mountaintops, but you can't really build a wind project up there very easily. So that's the kind of thing you take into consideration there. Progressing from there, once you settle on a site, you need to go and you need to lease up land. You need to talk to the landowners in the area. Might be 5 or 10 big landowners, might be 150 small farmers. Either way, you got to go and talk to every single one of them and sit at their kitchen table and make the case to them that this is something that they should do, that it's going to be good for them and good for you, mutually beneficial, and get them to sign a lease agreement that will allow you to use their property. You need to go through preliminary design and engineering. You need to coordinate environmental study work. You need to figure out what the permitting regime is and then go through that permitting process. You need to market the power. You need to find someone to buy the energy from the facility. You know, one thing that's very different in renewable energy as opposed to other industries is if you're building microchips, you might build a microchip factory. To be really simplified about it, you know, you might kind of do it on spec because you know there's a general market for these things. If I build it, I'll find somebody to sell it to. These facilities don't get built without a customer already lined up. That's just the nature of this industry for a variety of reasons. So you've got to find a customer. You'll coordinate preliminary engineering. And then once the project is finally ready to go into construction, you'll hand the project over to a construction project manager who will take it through to completion. So that's the broadest possible view of development. The responsibilities vary from company to company, but most independent power producers like EDP Renewables tend to take a pretty wide view of it. And as a developer, you get exposure to all of these different things and more. So it's a pretty exciting role. It's pretty dynamic, and every day is different. You're sort of constantly learning things. So that's project development in a nutshell. So as you're doing all this, you know, the goal is to obviously make the best project possible. It's not that hard to go find some land somewhere and sign it up and have sort of quote unquote a wind project, but you really want to have a good wind project. So what makes a good project? What's the goal of all of this? And that's kind of what I'm going to be covering today, but I'm going to come to it in a somewhat roundabout fashion. So we'll get there, but I want to sort of put that question out there and have you thinking about it. So in the process of development, as managers of these early stage decisions, we are constantly being asked to evaluate trade-offs. And we sort of have hinted at some of this earlier, but we're going to go through some examples here to give you a sense of the sorts of decisions that you'll be asked to make during the development process, which is essentially what, you know, development is basically what all of you are doing with your kind of paper wind farms near your universities. So here are just some example decisions that might come up. So, you know, at a big picture level, when you're doing like regional siting, you might be trying to decide, well, here's this transmission line, and I know I can interconnect to this transmission line fairly cheaply, but it's not that windy near here. And if I can go 30, 40 miles away, then I get up onto this ridge top where the wind speeds are much better. Well, I need to decide, should the project be in the windy area, but then have to bear the cost of 40 miles of transmission, which can be pretty expensive depending on the voltage and the type of lines you're building? Or should I be right next to the transmission line and have a cheaper project, but it produces less energy every year? That's the kind of decision that you might be asked to make. At a more small potatoes level, you might be in a position where you're trying to decide where the facilities should go within a specific site, and one piece of property has really high value crops on it that you're going to damage during construction, and you have to weigh that cost. But if you go around, you're going to be forced through a landowner who really doesn't want the facilities and has demanded a much higher value, a much higher price for the use of this property. So you might have to weigh that kind of decision. So that's kind of big picture versus small potatoes decisions. There's also sort of, you're faced with different decisions at the beginning of a project's life versus the later stages of the project's life. So at the beginning, you might be trying to decide, well, should these turbines go up on these hills where the winds are better, or should they go down sort of on the plateaus in this area where I can construct them more cheaply? Whereas in the late stage, you're dealing with more sort of micro scale decisions, such as, well, I've got this landowner that's kind of in between where I want to put the turbines and where my substation is going to go. I need to decide whether it's worth paying them to get through their property with my collection circuits, the circuits that bring the power from the turbines to the substation for delivery to the grid, or do I just go around them? How do I weigh those costs against one another? So, these are the sorts of decisions that you'd be faced with, and it's easy to say, like, oh, this is a trade-off. I think it's pretty clear that there's a trade-off there, but how do you decide which of these is the right thing to do? So two kind of general notes on that. I mean, we generally want to try to find ways to quantify these decisions so that we can evaluate them in a more scientific way. And that often requires putting numbers to these things. So you might need to do research to come up with estimated unit costs for, well, what does it cost to build a mile of road or a mile of collection? Very frequently, as developers, we're asked to figure out information about tax regimes. So, calling the county and asking the assessor, like, well, what's the property tax rate here? How is renewable energy property taxed? Or figuring out sales tax. Determining whether there are incentives in certain counties is another kind of common thing. Tax incentives are pretty typical. Figuring out whether those can be negotiated. So that type of like research and just sort of calling around and asking questions is a big part of development. A lot of what we do is first figuring out what the questions are and then answering them. I mean, it sounds basic, but that is a lot of it. So that type of research is a big deal. The other thing that we really need is a rubric to compare dissimilar costs and benefits, because oftentimes the costs and or the benefits don't sort of exist along the same dimension, so you can't do an apples to apples comparison. And I'm going to come to some detailed examples here that will explain that in clearer terms, I think. So an example of an easy choice, here's a little diagram. This is pretty basic, but what's going on here is the 6 green sort of crosses at the bottom represent wind turbine locations, and the thick yellow line represents an underground run of 34.5 kV collection systems. That's medium voltage lines that are trenched underground that deliver the power from the turbines back to the substation, which is the big black box with the lightning bolt symbol. So the power needs to go from the turbines to the substation. Blue land is land we have under control, under lease. We have contracts to use it, so we can take the collection through the blue land to get back to the sub. Now, alternatively, the orange land, we don't have that person. That's a landowner who's sort of against wind energy, or they're just very happy with their current land use. They don't want to deal with it, and they've said, look, you need to pay me $150,000 to sign up my land and make any use of it, and that's expensive. But if we do it in the dotted line, you can see we get to make our collection home run quite a bit shorter. It shaves us 1.5 miles of collection, and that collection costs money. Every linear foot we build of it might cost between $30 and $50, depending on the soil type. So in this case, this is a pretty easy choice to weigh, right? If the landowner's asking for $150,000 and the savings of reducing the collection lengths by 1.5 miles exceeds $150,000, then pretty obviously it makes sense to do that. It makes the whole project cheaper, and it doesn't affect anything else really, at least to a first approximation. We won't get into collection line losses today, but that's like the high level. So this is an easy choice to evaluate. Sometimes choices are really complicated, and this is where that rubric I mentioned earlier is useful. So I mentioned the example earlier of using a longer transmission line to reach a windier area. So say that the length of that transmission line is $10 million in upfront costs at the time you build the project. So upfront costs when you build, that's called CapEx or capital expenditures. But if you pay for that, then the project will generate $750,000 a year in increased revenue. Okay, how do I compare these two things? Because it's not an apples-to-apples basis. I'm comparing CapEx to ongoing revenue. Some of you may have heard of the concept of time value of money or discount rate. So that's very, very simply, that's the idea that $1 a year from now or 10 years from now is worth less than $1 today. And exactly how much that's the whole branch of finance around that, but that's the real basic concept. So it's not as simple as just adding up all of the revenues over, say, an assumed 25-year or 30-year project life and comparing that to the $10 million upfront costs. So it's more complicated than that. So how can we compare these two things in order to make this decision? And our goal with all of these trade-offs and decisions is to evaluate them and make sure that the resulting project is as good or as competitive as possible. I mentioned earlier, what makes a project good. So we're going to get to that now here. So this is the levelized cost of energy. The levelized cost of energy is essentially the ultimate project yardstick. And I actually am going to start with the output here and then talk about the inputs. But the levelized cost of energy is the cost for each unit of energy or megawatt hour generated by the facility. So basically, you can think of the facility as just a factory, a black box that turns out these little blocks of energy, and then we sell them like anything that comes out of any factory. The goal when you go out to a competitive market and you're bidding your project to utilities, for example, is they're going to get all these bids, and at least at a high level, essentially they're going to build the project they're going to pick the project with the lowest cost of energy, the low bid, right? Because it's a commodity market. All energy is the same. So you just get the cheapest energy you can. So if our goal as developers is to build projects, then what makes a project good is that it is the lowest possible levelized cost of energy, because that will make it competitive and that will cause it to get built. So that's really what makes a good project, and that's why these financial models are so important, because they are the yardstick by which we measure project quality. We want the projects to have the lowest, cheapest cost of energy possible. So as inputs into this levelized cost of energy calculation, and that's what the financial model does, is just calculate this levelized cost of energy. We've got all kinds of different things, and this is not an exhaustive list here, but on the capital expenditure side, we've got turbine purchases, which are far and away the largest single expense, upfront expense on any wind project. You've got construction costs, you've got crop damage payments to landowners, you've got sales tax that's paid at the time you build the facility, and on and on and on. Interconnection costs are in here as well. On the operational expenditure side, you've got the land royalties that you're paying. These are the rents you pay to your landowners that are hosting your facilities. You've got your operations and maintenance costs, staff to maintain these things. You've got property tax that you pay every year, and so on. Very frequently, you'll have environmental mitigation costs in here as well. On the revenue side, you've got the obvious, the revenue you get from selling the energy, and the green attributes associated with the energy, the renewable energy credits. You've also got the production tax credits coming in from the federal government. And then the last thing you have to deal with is what's called your cost of capital. At a really simplistic conceptual level, you could think of this as the rate you pay on a loan that you take out to build the facility. So if you're building a $200 million wind project, you get a loan from a bank, and then you have to pay that loan back over time, say at some rate, 6, 8, 10% a year. In reality, a lot of companies finance on their balance sheets, but you can think of it as a loan. So you take all these inputs, you put them into a financial model, and you choose the cost of energy, because you don't really have a choice over what your CapEx is. A lot of your OpEx, you don't have it. At the time you're building the model, it's sort of, you don't have a choice about these things. The thing that you can choose is what dollar per megawatt hour am I charging for all of the energy I generate? In other words, what is my cash revenue from the project? And you make that choice such that you cover all of your CapEx, all of your operational expenditures, you cover your cost of capital, and you're paying off your lender, you're paying for the project, you're paying for the operational expenses, and then you're also meeting an internal return hurdle so that your company is making some money on the project as well. At a really structural, conceptual level, that's what is going into a levelized cost of energy calculation. So when we're making all these trade-offs in development, we're making them with an eye towards reducing the levelized cost of energy in order to improve competitiveness and improve the likelihood that the project gets built. So that's really why these financial models are so important, because everything that we do at the upfront during the development stage is all about making the project better, and the way we determine whether we're succeeding at that goal is through the financial model. And then obviously it's also really important to get the model right, so that when you bid the project, you're bidding the correct cost of energy, and if you actually go forth and build it, then you're getting the revenues you need to cover all your costs. So it's really important to get right for that reason as well. So that's the end of my set of the slideshow. And I don't know if we're going to pause for questions at this point, or if we're going to turn it over to Caroline and Annie.
Thanks, Toby. That's great.
Go ahead.
We will hold questions until we're finished presenting. Thanks so much. That was excellent. And just as a reminder, we're still hearing some background noise. If everyone can just check their phones and computers and make sure you're muted so we can remove that background noise, that would be excellent. Oh, that's great. Okay, so next we have Annie McClelland and Caroline Twitchell from RES. Annie is the manager of origination at RES, a leading developer and constructor of wind, solar, transmission, and energy storage projects. Annie leads RES's relationships with numerous off-takers, including corporates and utilities. Prior to joining RES, Annie worked at Citizens Campaign for the Environment, a nonprofit with offices in New York State and Connecticut. There, she focused on advancing large-scale renewable energy projects on Long Island, resulting in power purchase agreements for 11 new renewable energy projects in December of 2014. Annie completed her undergraduate degree at Cornell University and holds an MBA from Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Caroline Twitchell is the Senior Finance Manager on the Project Finance and M&A team at RES. During her 6 years with RES, she's been involved with wind, solar, and battery storage transactions, created business plans for new RES ventures, and managed project and team budgets for the Americas business units. She also leads the Americas Gender Diversity Committee and is committed to promoting the representation of women in the energy industry and within RES. Caroline received her bachelor's degree in international business economics from UC San Diego and an MBA from CU Boulder. Welcome, Annie and Caroline.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. So can you see our slides?
We see your slides. Are they PDF? Is that what they? Okay, there we go. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. So just a brief overview of RES. RES is a renewable energy development and construction company. We have been around for 35 years, which actually is a really long time for a renewable energy company. We started back when solar panels were something that was only on celebrities' houses. So we've been here for a long time, and we've seen lots of changes in the market over our 35-year history. We operate globally. We have over 3 gigawatts of operational assets, and our project portfolio is over 16 gigawatts. We have about 2,000 employees. In the United States, we're based in Broomfield, Colorado, and we do have offices throughout the world. You can see we develop and construct wind, solar, storage, as well as transmission and distribution. But I want to kind of draw your attention to the activities portion of this slide. You can see we develop, construct, and operate the projects that we manage. However, unlike EDP, we don't own the projects long term. So when we're modeling the financial models for them, we're focused on looking at them from the point of view of the long-term owner. And with that, I will pass it off to Caroline.
Great, thanks. Give me a second here. Okay, great. So here we're hitting on something Toby already touched on, which is the project life cycle. And what I've circled here are the stages in which RES is continually updating our financial model inputs for a specific project. So during the development phase, which can encompass 1 to 3 or more years, typically on a wind project, we are constantly revisiting the inputs that we are putting into our models. And some of those Toby touched on, and I'll dive into some of those with more detail as well. But I just wanted to kind of point out that, again, we're focusing on this phase of before the shovel hits the ground, as Toby mentioned, and we're trying to get our LCOE price or PPA rate, power purchase agreement rate, as low as we can so that it can competitively be bid against other projects either in the same area or often in other areas of the country that we're competing against or competing in. And so basically this is just kind of from a high level, the life cycle, and RES typically, or the team that I work on, is focusing on kind of the upfront costs that are going into the model. I just want to draw everyone's attention to kind of the bottom of all of my slides will have a section called Acronym 101 and helpful links. And the idea of this section is to point out some of the acronyms that are thrown around quite frequently in the industry. So I've spelled out what some of those are, so there's less confusion, and then also link to some sources that are publicly available. So as we start getting into the weeds on some of these finance slides, talking about depreciation, cost of capital, internal rate of return, all of those are terms that I've tried to call out specific pieces of information that all of the students can look at after this webinar and try to understand more of the background and the context of how those terms fit into your financial modeling exercise. So step one for building your financial model will be to start with your upfront cost. So and step one, I should say, of building a 20-year cash flow in Excel, since you've been asked to look at the 20-year expected life of your wind project. So you're going to start with your year zero costs, which I've outlined above in A through E. So first, you'll have your development costs, which will be the costs that you incur leading up to construction, and those can consist of your land payments as you're signing leases with landowners, your permitting costs, your interconnection study costs, travel costs, costs of the developer's time as they're meeting with landowners and trying to understand the feasibility of a site. B will be your build costs, which you can see in the graph. Majority of your build costs will be your turbine costs, followed by your balance of plant costs or your construction costs of the other equipment that's installed near and around and supporting the turbines, like your foundations. Then you have as C, you have your development fee, which is really the profit that the development company like RES or EDP will charge for all the work they've done up front to get the project to a point of construction. You have your net capacity factor, which is shown typically as a percentage, and that's driving kind of the number of megawatt hours that you're selling every year of electricity that are generated from the project in year 1 through year 20. And then lastly, you have your construction financing costs, which is typically, a debt rate a percentage that you're applying to your total build costs. And this would be the amount charged for financing the project construction that Toby alluded to. So now that you have your upfront costs, step 2 will be your operating costs. So these are the costs the project will incur from year 1 through year 20. And so typically we'll start with some of the operating costs. Again, Toby covered some of these already, but your land costs. So what are you paying your landowners to use their land to build the site? Is that structured as a percentage of revenues, kind of like a royalty payment? Or is that structured as a dollar per acre that each landowner is paid? You'll have your turbine warranty payments that you're paying to your turbine provider, your turbine vendor. You'll have insurance that's typically a percentage applied to your total build cost. And then you'll have G&A or general and administrative costs. So the cost of your accountants preparing invoices every month, or your legal team, your tax team, and your management that are overseeing the operation of the project every year. Then we'll get into B on step 2, tax and depreciation. So we have, first step would be to look at all the different tax rates that will apply to your project. Because your project will be located typically in a county or a city that's within, a state, and then you have federal taxes as well, there'll be multiple tax rates that you want to collect and make sure you account for. So you have federal and state income tax. You have your local property tax, which will be based off of, your county and your state specifically. Then you'll need to look at your depreciation schedule. And for renewable energy projects, they are subject to schedules that are dictated under something called MACRS, which is, as you can see in the bottom part of this slide, stands for Modified Accelerated Cost Recovery System. And I put a link there for the IRS schedules that you can look up specifically to see which schedule should be applied to a wind project. And what I mean by schedule is they'll show you, the IRS specifies the percentage amounts that you can apply to your year zero upfront build cost. And depreciation is a little bit of a tricky thing if you're not familiar with it, because it's really a non-cash type of concept, but it's something that you will need to factor in when you're calculating what your federal and state income taxes will be. So in some ways, it looks like an operating cost, but I haven't put it on this graph here because you want to make sure that you'll use it to, you'll add in depreciation to calculate your income tax, but then you'll want to take it back out when you're looking at cash flows. And so again, I would just point you to kind of the IRS link that I put at the bottom of this slide, and then I would encourage you to do more research on kind of the application of it as well, because it does lead to these yellow bars where in the early years you have tax credits that look like a cash payment to the project versus in the further out years of the project where you're paying income taxes. And again, the reason for that is that early on in the first 5 years, especially because of the maker's effect on wind projects specifically, you're basically, it looks like your projects are operating at a loss from the IRS's perspective. And so they're saying you don't owe us taxes while you're operating at a loss. You're trying to recover your investment that you paid up front, millions of dollars, typically hundreds of millions of dollars to build the project. So they're letting you kind of write off this expense and giving you credits, which is why you see these yellow bars as a positive project cost in the early years. And so I would just say, don't be surprised if when you're doing your cash flow statements, this looks a little wonky in that you have positive cash from tax payments in early years and negative tax payments in later years. So then after you've looked at your depreciation and calculated your tax, you want to then look at your production tax credits, or PTCs. These are revenue streams that are provided from, this is a revenue stream or credit that's paid by the federal government for wind projects. And this is applicable for the first 10 years of a project. So you see the gray bars look like positive cash flow to the project. And again, these rates are dictated by the IRS, and I provided a link at the bottom of the slide to figure out what that rate will be. It will be $1 per megawatt hour that's generated by the project for the first 10 years. And so you want to make sure to capture those in your cash flow, since that looks like an additional revenue stream beyond your revenue contract or your PPA. Then my last step here is just once you calculated your tax, make sure you add that, kind of pull out the depreciation calculation that you added in from makers. And so what that will mean is in your cash flow, you'll be looking at revenue, less operating expenses, less tax, plus PTCs. So that'll be for all of your operating costs from year 1 through year 20, and you want to calculate that individually for every year. Then on the next slide, we'll talk about how to add in revenue, since we haven't quite gotten to calculating that yet. So for step 3, there are quite a few acronyms here. Again, I'll point you to the bottom of the slide and I'll try to walk through this as straightforwardly as I can. So in this graph, the graph is the same as step 2, except I've added the orange bars for revenue, and I've added this green line, which is showing basically the return on investment for the project owner. And why that's important is because you're going to first need to figure out what your target IRR or internal rate of return is to drive what your revenue number will be. So you want to figure out, and to clarify, I have a secondary axis on this graph, and so this green line is not in millions of dollars. This green line is a percentage, where in the early years, it's really about 0% or less than 0%. And then over time, closer to year 20 at the end of the project term, you are going to, that project owner is going to see return on their investment. Very similar to a bank loaning money. It's going to need that return on their investment over the period of time that they're giving you the loan for. So there are a few steps to this. We've already shown step 1, which is A on this slide. Start with your year 0 upfront cost to build the project. B, you're looking at your operating costs over 20 years. Now we're at C. How do you figure out what your IRR or cost of capital that Toby mentioned, or another word is weighted average cost of capital, or WACC, is? In the scope of this challenge, you've been asked to take into account the cost of debt and return on debt and return on equity. So to do that, you'll need to figure out what portion of the project is going to be debt and which portion of the project is going to be equity. And by that I mean the millions of dollars in upfront costs. So let's say it costs $150 million in year 0 to build your project. How much of that is going to be coming from a lender, and how much is going to be coming from equity? And so you'll make a decision there on the split, and you'll also need to make a decision on what the rates that each of those partners will need to make. And those inputs together will drive what your green line target will be. So an example might be, let's say your lender on the debt is going to give you $50 million and they want a return of 5%. And then your equity is going to give you $100 million and they want 10%. So I've put some links here at the bottom of how to calculate your WACC, because you'll basically need to come up with how to blend those rates and those dollar amounts to get to one single-digit percentage that will be your IRR target. So once you have your IRR target, then you will be calculating for every year in operation from year 0 to year 20, your net present value. And Toby talked about this as the time of money. So $1 today is worth more than $1 down the road. And what I would suggest here is that you use the NPV formula in Excel to calculate the NPV for years 1 through years 20. Positive net present value will indicate that the project is profitable, versus an investment with a negative NPV will result in a net loss. So to calculate your NPV, you want to make sure that you include all of your upfront costs from year 0 as a negative number. That's really important. So you have that negative number in year 0, and then you're going to have positive numbers, once the project is operational from year 1 through year 20. And so you'll start with calculating your revenue for each year as megawatt hours generated by the project times, and for now you'll have a placeholder, your PPA rate or your LCOE. So we're going to have to back solve for that LCOE. So stay with me. We're going to figure out our revenue by leaving a placeholder for that LCOE rate. Then you're adding in, again, your PTCs, you're subtracting your operating costs, and your taxes paid or paid to the IRS or paid to the project. And you're going to specify in your NPV formula in Excel what your IRR is. And this can also be, another phrase for this term is discount rate. And again, I've provided some links there on how to calculate NPV in Excel. So then once you have your annual NPVs calculated, which again, we still have to figure out your LCOE or your revenue, but you kind of have to set up those formulas in Excel. And then we're going to go back and figure out what your LCOE is. So how you figure out your LCOE or your PPA rate is you're going to use another function in Excel called the goal seek function, which is under the what if analysis button in Excel. And you're going to set your year 20 NPV cell to 0 by changing your PPA price cell. Excel will then solve for you what your dollar per megawatt hour LCOE rate is. So another sense check at this point is that if you're using Excel to calculate your IRR, that's another function you can use as a sanity check. It should return your target WACC or your target IRR in year 20 once you have your PPA rate solved for. So now my last step on step 4, once you have your LCOE rate or your PPA rate for your project, Another good sanity check is to look at what are other wholesale electricity prices in your region or just in general for wind projects. And some of that might require some online research, but I've provided a graph here of kind of how prices have trended in terms of wholesale electricity in different regions over the last 10 years. And so this is just kind of, again, another sanity check where you can compare the price that your model is spitting out and see if it looks really high or if it looks really low. And maybe that drives you to reevaluate and double check some of your inputs. You know, make sure you have your PTCs flowing in, make sure your average wind speed or your NCF is competitive with others in the region, and kind of see what resources are available online that may give you some kind of points of comparison to see how your price is stacking up compared to others in the region. And that's it for me.
Excellent. Thanks, Caroline. That was wonderful. This time, we'll open it up for questions from any of the participants. So I know we covered a lot of content, or Toby, Annie, and Caroline did, covered a lot of content that was most likely a lot to ingest. So Aaron just asked, will these slides be available? So we will be posting the recording on Box, and as long as Carolyn, Annie, and Toby consent, we will also be sharing their slides there as well. Is that the intent, Toby and Caroline?
Yes.
Okay. So yes, we will be sharing those slides for you to reference. Does somebody have a question?
No, sorry, that was my technical glitch.
Oh, okay. So I just want to encourage you all, especially the students on the line, but faculty members as well, if you want to pose questions, this is going to be your best opportunity to pose questions to these presenters, who are going to most likely be your best source of information for the project development portion. So don't be afraid. Okay, so we have a question that came through. Can you talk a little bit about how you decide on using a new technology, say for a blade, turbine, or tower? I ask this because it creates some uncertainties.
I'm happy to field that one. So I'd say from a developer's perspective, we're getting more here, great. So I'll cover the blade one first. I'd say from a developer's perspective, to some degree, it's not exactly up to us whether we're going to use the most cutting edge technology, because we're going out to market to these turbine OEMs, the folks who make the turbines, and they sort of say, here, we have this slate of turbines you can purchase. So they're the ones who are doing the R&D, and ultimately, hopefully, they're not bringing us anything that's like too risky. They've kind of vetted it already before it comes to us. But in terms of how we evaluate like a new tower, say a taller tower or a bigger blade, we will essentially evaluate it using the same rubric we talked about here. We'll look at the costs. What does it cost to this new blade? What are the benefits? How much does it, increase production? Say that's typically what you're trying to do with bigger blades, because they usually are more expensive. They always are more expensive, so they better bring some benefit in terms of revenue. And you'll run it all through the financial model, and you'll say, well, does this new technology result in a higher or a lower cost of energy? If it's lower, then you use it, and it's kind of that simple. Typically, for newer technology, you will see some other moving parts in the model. You may reduce the expected availability on a brand new turbine technology that's less proven or that your company has less experience with. So that means you expect it to be down for maintenance more often throughout the year, and that will tend to mitigate the benefits brought by that new technology. So you sort of bake in some assumptions, and this is what you're talking about with the uncertainties, I think. You bake in some assumptions around, well, you know, we need to be a little more conservative on how well we can run this new turbine technology. But if the benefits it brings outweighs the cost and those uncertainties in the financial model, then it is something that you'll do.
Another thing to consider is who is actually going to be buying the power. I know when I work with corporate off-takers, they seem to be very concerned about the turbine technology, whether or not it's been used before and it has, you know, it's proven. So they want some assurity that the technology isn't going to, you know, if it's a brand new thing, that it's not just going to have a bunch of issues right away. They want a little more certainty in that. So there are some other benefits to using, you know, not the newest thing out of the box.
Great, thank you guys. The next question, what does a typical land lease or purchase look like? Is there like a baseline?
Do you guys want me to tackle that? I've been talking kind of a lot, but happy to handle it.
Why don't you jump in, Toby, and if Caroline and Annie have anything to add, they can chime in.
Sure. I'd say the unfortunate answer to this is that there kind of is no typical thing here. I will say that for wind projects, property purchases are extremely rare, like vanishingly rare. There's a variety of reasons for that, but you think about the nature of a wind project is that it's very spread out, and you might ultimately need to have, for a 100 megawatt project, say, you might need 10 or 15,000 acres under contract, but the actual part of that you will impact with your infrastructure, your turbines and your roads, will be something like 1 to 2% of that. So you don't want to buy all that property if you're only going to use a small amount of it. So property purchases are extraordinarily rare. So it's almost always a land lease, so I can at least answer that part of it. I'd say like the prototypical wind lease would be a bare royalty. So it's a revenue sharing arrangement where you say to the landowner that it depends on the market, right? It depends on the prevailing land use in that area, whether the land is high value or low value, if there's other wind projects in the area, if you have competition, that will change the rate that you pay for property. But ultimately, it's, you know, the market is whatever you can agree to all the landowners with. But typically what you do is a revenue sharing agreement where they'll get some percentage of the project's royalties, sort of speak really broadly, you know, under 10%. So, you know, 1 to 10%. I guess it's sort of commercially sensitive information, so I can't get super specific about that, but that's kind of the typical range, I'd say. That's the most typical kind of land lease, and then sometimes you'll get into situations where there's like a minimum payment baked into there too. But I'd say for simplicity's sake, think about just bare royalties.
Thanks, Toby. The next question, how do you get turbine data from a manufacturer related to cost and power curve data that isn't directly posted by the manufacturer?
I'm not really sure. That might be an NREL question. Because usually, you know, as private companies, we're negotiating directly with a turbine supplier.
Yes, so I think it's difficult to get specific information. Some of you might remember getting power curves last year, and we worked with Siemens basically to develop a sort of a theoretical turbine power curve. There's some information out there about general cost per megawatt, but I think probably getting specific information from the turbine manufacturer. And if that's a common kind of experience for everyone, we can sort of take some time to think about how to help support you all to find sort of generic turbine costs.
I was just going to suggest, I don't know if AWEA is at all, you know, willing to share some of their reports, but they do, you know, collect some of that information at a high level and talk about dollars per kilowatt costs among different vendors too.
poll?
So we can reach out to AWEA and see if that's something they can share for the benefit of the teams. But I guess if this is a pinch point for all teams, or if this is a big obstacle that you're facing, then we need to know that. And we won't know if you don't tell us. And so I think it would be good if teams don't feel comfortable posting this on the Google group because it feels sensitive, but you want to send Heidi a direct message. Why don't you send Heidi a direct email letting her know whether or not this is posing or obstacle for your team, or if there are additional obstacles that you're facing that you do not know how to overcome. And then if we're seeing trends across the teams, then we will look to find ways to supplement and find ways to fill those gaps. But we want to make sure that we're doing it, what we're doing is equitable and fair, and taking into consideration the effort that each individual team is putting in. So, yeah, so send Heidi an email. Let's see, we've got another question. So if you have the question is whether or not we have additional questions, can we reach out to the speakers and how to contact them? So if you have additional questions that come up, send them to Heidi, and then Heidi will, whether reaching out to Toby, Annie, and Caroline, or finding another way to respond to that question, she will provide answers and provide them directly or to all teams on the Google group so everybody's getting the same information.
And everyone should have my email. I sent out a message yesterday via the Google group addressing this same question. So,
yep. Okay, we've got 6 minutes left. Does anybody else have any other questions to pose? We'll give you a couple minutes. Or Heidi, do you have a question? I'm putting you on the spot. Do you have a question that you want to pose? You can say no.
I don't
know.
No
is unacceptable. Okay. Okay, so I guess as corny as it sounds, Toby, Annie, and Caroline, do you guys have any words of wisdom, general words of wisdom to share with the teams as they tackle this this project and prepare for competition?
I would say just from the financial modeling perspective, I know it's easy to get lost in all the details, so don't be afraid to make estimates and make guesses and trial and error and try to figure it out. I'm sure it will take some iterations to figure out your cost of energy, but just, don't get discouraged, and if you don't know something, I would say use a placeholder and then come back to it.
That's exactly the advice I had.
Great.
Yep, you guys read my mind. I mean, don't get wrapped around the axle on whether your turbine costs are, $850 a kW or $1,000 a kW. Ultimately, I think the purpose of the exercise is to get you to understand how a financial model fits together, and the exact sort of unit quantities and costs are less important than the model itself, in that it has the correct structure and that you understand how we get to levelized cost of energy. So don't worry too much about the inputs. Get rough proxies and keep moving.
Great. I think that's a good point. Don't get too paralyzed in the process. Okay, so we're gonna pose one last question, which is, can you touch on how the process changes for offshore wind farm development? Any other costs to consider?
I would say the factor will increase dramatically. Those costs are so expensive.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot more. RES doesn't develop or construct offshore wind, so I don't think we have anything exact to give you guys, but it's going to be more expensive. I mean, you're building things out on the water, so, and you have you know, think about if it's 3 miles out there, that's a long transmission line, things like that.
Right. And I think you know, maybe dig around online what in terms of like, because your lease payments are a little bit different. You're working with state governments and sometimes
And federal, yeah.
So maybe see what you can find that's been published online about those lease payments and see what you can dig up. I know that there was a PPA published online years ago for a wind project. So I would see if you could just see what's available online for some of those. It is kind of early stages on that sector of the industry. So your end result price will be that much higher than the other teams.
But I believe that the lease sale information is publicly available, especially those that are facilitated through BOEM. But Toby, it sounded like you had something to add there.
Oh, just that, you know, the development process, the construction process, all that is obviously totally different for offshore wind farm development. But in terms of the financial modeling process, exactly the same. The inputs are different, right? What it costs to build it, what it costs to operate it, all that's different. But the financial model is going to be doing the exact same thing, which is you've got your CapEx, your OpEx, your cost of capital, and you're going to be back solved and get an LCOE. So the financial model is a very general tool, and it would apply just as well to an offshore project. It's just different inputs.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you all. Thank you to our speakers for sharing your time and expertise with us, and thank you to everybody who was able to attend and for the wonderful questions that you posed. And if you have any additional questions, again, send those through Heidi, and to get the recording and slides available up as soon as possible, possibly as early as this afternoon. And then I will notify you through the Google group and provide a link to access that so you can download and share with your teammates. With that, we will close the webinar and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.